Australia seems simple from a distance. A giant island continent surrounded by blue ocean filled with beaches, deserts, kangaroos, and modern cities. But Australia is far older, stranger, and more complicated than that postcard image suggests. It contains one of the oldest continuous human cultures on Earth, a colonial history built on prison ships and conquest, and a modern identity shaped by migration, war, wealth, and distance. To understand Australia today, we have to travel back tens of thousands of years, long before Sydney existed, long before the British Empire arrived, and long before anyone called this land Australia. Australia's geography also shaped its isolation and identity. The interior, often called the outback, contains deserts, rocky ranges, and enormous cattle stations separated by vast distances. Around the coast, fertile regions supported most of the population. Unique animals evolved in isolation, including kangaroos, koalas, wombats, and the platypus. The first people reached the continent at least 65,000 years ago. At that time, sea levels were lower, and Australia was connected to New Guinea in a larger landmass called Sahul. These early communities spread across forests, deserts, grasslands, mountains, and coastlines. Over thousands of generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples developed hundreds of distinct nations, languages, traditions, and systems of law. Their societies were not primitive, and they were not simply wandering without purpose. Communities managed the environment through controlled burning, seasonal movement, fishing systems, farming, hunting, and careful knowledge of water and weather. Trade routes stretched across enormous distances, carrying tools, shells, ochre, stories, and ceremonies between different groups. Central to many cultures was what English speakers often call the dreaming. It was not merely a collection of myths. It connected creation, ancestors, law, land, identity, and responsibility. The landscape itself carried memory. Rivers, rocks, animals, and paths were linked to stories that explained both how the world began and how people were expected to live within it. For thousands of years, Australia remained largely unknown to Europeans. Ancient geographers imagined a great southern land, believing it might balance the continents of the northern hemisphere. By the 17th century, Dutch sailors were mapping parts of the northern and western coastline. In 1606, Willem Janszoon became the first recorded European to land on the continent. Other Dutch explorers followed, and the region became known in Europe as New Holland. But the decisive moment came in 1770, when British navigator James Cook charted the eastern coastline. He claimed it for Britain and named it New South Wales. The British acted as though the land belonged to no one, even though indigenous peoples had lived there for tens of thousands of years. This idea later became known as terra nullius, meaning land belonging to nobody. It was a legal fiction, but it gave the empire a convenient excuse for taking control. Britain had another problem. Its prisons were overcrowded, and after losing the American colonies, it needed somewhere new to send convicts. In 1788, the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove carrying prisoners, soldiers, officials, and settlers. This marked the beginning of permanent British colonization. Life in the early colony was harsh. Food was limited, supplies were unreliable, and many convicts faced forced labor and severe punishment. Yet some prisoners eventually gained freedom, received land, or built new lives. Over time, the colony expanded beyond Sydney, and more settlements appeared around the coastline. For Indigenous Australians, the consequences were devastating. European diseases spread rapidly through communities with no immunity. Settlers occupied water sources, hunting grounds, and sacred places. Conflict followed as Indigenous people resisted invasion and defended their land. The frontier wars were not one single war, but hundreds of local conflicts across the continent. Indigenous fighters used their knowledge of the land to attack settlements, livestock, and military patrols. British forces, police, and settlers responded with raids, shootings, and massacres. Figures such as Pemulwuy became symbols of resistance, although many other leaders and communities were excluded from official histories. By the 19th century, Britain had established several separate colonies, including New South Wales, Tasmania, Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and Queensland. Sheep farming became a major industry, and Australian wool was exported across the empire. Vast areas of land were taken for farms and stations, creating enormous private fortunes. Then gold transformed the continent. In 1851, major discoveries in New South Wales and Victoria triggered a gold rush. People arrived from Britain, Ireland, Europe, China, and the Americas, hoping to become rich. Towns grew almost overnight. Roads, businesses, banks, and ports expanded. Melbourne became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. But the goldfields also produced tension. Chinese miners faced racism, violence, and discriminatory taxes. European miners complained about expensive licenses and corrupt officials. In 1854, miners at Ballarat built a defensive position known as the Eureka Stockade. Government troops attacked, killing several rebels. The uprising failed militarily, but it became a powerful symbol of democracy, political representation, and resistance to unfair government. As the colonies became richer, the idea of uniting them gained support. They shared language, trade, defense concerns, and British institutions, but they also competed with one another. After years of debate, the 6 colonies agreed to form a federation. On the 1st of January 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was created. The new nation had a federal parliament and its own constitution, but it remained closely tied to Britain. Australia was democratic for many white citizens, yet that democracy had clear limits. One of the first major policies of the new government was the White Australia policy, designed to restrict non-European immigration. Indigenous Australians were also excluded from many rights, denied political recognition, and subjected to state control. In many areas, governments removed Indigenous children from their families in an attempt to absorb them into white society. These children later became known as the Stolen Generations. Australia presented itself as a free and democratic nation, but freedom depended heavily on a person's race and background. When Britain entered the First World War in 1914, Australia entered as part of the empire. Thousands volunteered to fight overseas. In 1915, Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in the Ottoman Empire. The campaign failed and caused heavy casualties, but it became central to the Anzac legend, celebrating courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and mateship. Australian forces later fought on the Western Front, where the losses were even greater. By the end of the war, tens of thousands of Australians had died, a huge number for a small population. The conflict left deep emotional scars and strengthened a sense of national identity separate from Britain. During the Second World War, Australia again fought alongside Britain, but Japan's rapid advance across Asia changed everything. The fall of Singapore in 1942 destroyed the belief that the British Empire could always protect Australia. Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin, and fighting reached nearby New Guinea. Australia turned increasingly towards the United States for security, beginning a partnership that remained central to its foreign policy. After 1945, Australia launched a massive immigration program. The government believed the country needed a larger population for defense and economic growth. Millions of migrants arrived from Europe, including Britain, Italy, Greece, Germany, and the Netherlands. Later, immigration expanded from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and other regions. The White Australia policy was gradually dismantled, and multiculturalism became a major part of national identity. Australian cities changed dramatically, with new languages, foods, religions, and communities reshaping daily life. At the same time, Indigenous Australians continued fighting for equality. Activists organized protests, freedom rides, strikes, and legal campaigns. In 1967, Australians voted overwhelmingly to change the constitution, allowing the federal government to make laws concerning Indigenous people and include them in the national census. In 1992, the High Court delivered the Mabo decision. It rejected terra nullius and recognized that Indigenous land rights had existed before British colonization. The decision led to legal recognition of native title, although disputes over land, sovereignty, recognition, and justice did not disappear. Modern Australia is one of the world's most urbanized countries. Most people live in coastal cities such as Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. The economy has been shaped by mining, agriculture, education, tourism, finance, and trade with Asia. Australia exports iron ore, coal, natural gas, wheat, and other resources. Its wealth has helped create high living standards, but it has also produced difficult arguments about environmental damage and dependence on fossil fuels. The country is especially vulnerable to climate change. Droughts, heat waves, coral bleaching, and major bushfires have become central political issues. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the world's most famous natural wonders, faces serious pressure from warming oceans. Australia also faces questions about housing costs, immigration, relations with China, its alliance with the United States, and its responsibilities in the Pacific region. Australia is often described as a young country, and politically, that is true. Yet its human story is ancient. The continent was never empty. It was already full of nations, laws, memories, and cultures.